Hello and welcome to this 1 hour at the cross for Good Friday under very strange circumstances, but I hope you'll be able to get something out of this, these 5 talks and the time together. Do use the order of service which you'll find on the website, gives you some structure for this. It's got a couple of hymns which you're welcome to listen to or to read or to even sing if you wish during this time. The idea, I'll be giving 5 talks, short talks, giving you some ideas and some thoughts, some challenges to think about and to pray about, and during a time of silence between the talks, which is up to you really how long you take for that. We're going to be looking at 4 passages from Luke's Gospel, account of the crucifixion, and 1 passage from Matthew, which I'll explain why we're using that passage when we get there. I'm going to be reading them from Tom Wright's translation of the New Testament, called the New Testament for Everyone, just to give it a fresh feel to it. And the first one, we're looking at Jesus is crucified. And we're beginning at verse 26, where we read, "As they led him away, they grabbed a man from Cyrene called Simon, who was coming into the city from outside, and they forced him to carry the crossbeam behind Jesus. A great crowd of people followed Jesus, including women who were mourning and wailing for him. Jesus turned and spoke to them. 'Daughters of Jerusalem,' he said, 'don't cry for me, cry for yourselves instead. Cry for your children. Listen, the time is coming when you will say, a blessing on the barren, a blessing on wombs that never bore children, and breasts that never nursed them. At that time, people will start to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. Yes, if this is what they do with the green tree, what will happen to the dry one?' 2 other criminals were taken away with him to be executed. When they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there, with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. 'Father,' Jesus said, 'forgive them. They don't know what they are doing.' They divided his clothes, casting lots for them. The people stood around watching. The rulers hurled abuse at him. 'He rescued others,' they said. 'Let him try rescuing himself, if he really is the Messiah, God's chosen one.' The soldiers added their taunts, coming up and offering him cheap wine. 'If you're the king of the Jews,' they said, 'rescue yourself.' The charge was written above him, 'This is the King of the Jews.'" At this rather strange time in our history, it's quite appropriate to be looking at one of the most shocking periods in Jesus' life. It, in many ways, was his darkest moment. He'd been betrayed. Even his closest friend, Peter, had denied him. And all of his friends had deserted him. He'd been tried on false charges. He'd been ridiculed. He'd been proclaimed in a mocking way as a king. He'd been whipped mercilessly. He was so weak, he could hardly carry his own cross. And Simon of Cyrene, a complete stranger as far as we know, was forced to carry it for him. What's interesting is that Mark tells us something more about Simon. In Mark's Gospel, we read that he was the father of Alexander and Rufus, which suggests that these characters were known to the Christian community. They'd become Christians. And in fact, many believe that Rufus is also referred to by the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 16, verse 13, where he says, "Greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother, who has been a mother to me too." Here in this passage we're looking at, Luke tells of women who mourned and wailed for him. Among these women could have been Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of Jesus. What would they be thinking? What would Jesus have looked like? He was blooded, staggering under the weight of the cross, blood dripping from where the crown of thorns had been pressed on his head. And yet he says to them, "Weep for yourselves and for your children." When we consider the story of Jesus, even this most tragic part, we need to ask ourselves, what does it mean for me? I'll say more about the criminals in a moment, but it's interesting to note the restraint with which the crucifixion is described. In verse 32, we simply read, "When they came to the place called the Skull, there they crucified him." No detail given at all, no dwelling on the pain and the brutality. Just a simple statement, and I'll leave you to ponder that. All four Gospels record the fact that the charge against Jesus was nailed to the cross. "This is the King of the Jews." Was it written ironically? John tells us in his Gospel that it was written in 3 languages, Aramaic, Latin and Greek, so that it could be read by anybody. He also tells us the chief priests objected, understandably. They didn't believe he was the King of the Jews. They said, "Write instead, this man claimed to be the King of the Jews." But Pilate replies, "What I have written, I have written." If you take hold of the orders of service now and do join with me in the response which you'll find following the first talk. "O my people, O my church, what have I done to you? Or in what way have I offended you? Testify against me. I led you forth from the land of Egypt and delivered you by the waters of baptism. But you have prepared a cross for your Saviour. Holy God, holy and strong, holy and immortal, have mercy on me."